Pleasure. I have the pleasure tonight of introducing my dear friend, who also happens to be the chair of the board of Cherry Hill Seminary, and recently earned his 2-year professional certificate of spiritual direction.
Good.
But he is Jeffrey Keefer, PhD, is an educational consultant, institutional researcher, and accreditation officer in higher ed. He's a professor of research methodology, nonprofit capacity building, and a strategic planning consultant, educational coach, spiritual life advisor / chaplain at New York University, spiritual director, and Wikipedian. So he graciously agreed to share with us this evening, and I'm glad that we'll have a recording. Thank you for letting us do that, Jeffrey, for the people who can't be here tonight. And so we're going to turn it over to you and invite you to share about your wonderful journey you made last year, right? Or the year before?
Last year.
And
yeah. Yep. And I shall talk about that, and I'll talk about some of the upcoming plans as well.
Okay.
So great. Let me just share my screen here, and you should see it there. Okay. So thank you so much for this invitation. I'm very excited to talk about this. When all of you did your introductions earlier, just before we turned on the recording, I was making mental notes. It's like, oh, I can relate with that. Oh, I understand that. Oh, I was there. So I feel like I'm among colleagues here, which is lovely in many, many ways. And I'll talk a little bit about myself also within the context, certainly, of some of this introductory pieces here. So my goal is to talk about and really present this, give or take, in 45 minutes, and then have time for questions or discussions. If there's anything that's pressing that comes up while I'm taking a sip of my tea or my seltzer water here, please, by all means, just yell it out. But I'd be very, very eager to hear your thoughts, questions, comments, feedback, certainly afterwards. And I'm hoping that we could have some sort of a discussion on this. So thank you once again. So the title of this presentation that I have here is A Druid's Pilgrimage, My Path Along the French Route of the Camino de Santiago. And if any of that is unclear to you, I'll be getting to that in most haste, shall we say. So just to start this off, I just invite us to just maybe close or lower our eyes just very, very briefly, and to just call into whatever we perceive as being sacred for ourselves to be open to the spirit of inspiration, however it may land upon us on this day. And I have, may the kindred, the gods, the ancestors, and the nature spirits inspire us all to walk our own paths, and in so doing, to make the world a better place. And I really believe that that is one of the elements of pilgrimage. It's very, very personal, but we don't really live all alone. We live in a world. And what happens on pilgrimage often has some mystical and surprising and profoundly powerful opportunities to affect the world and to hopefully make the world a better place. So what I want to talk about tonight, I'm going to give some background to all of this, background to the Camino, background to pilgrimage, the notion of pilgrimage, how this started, and then what did I actually do? And this happened last summer. So what did I actually do in June for a week? What did I learn along the process, and what's coming next? And I'm hoping, because I'm an educator at heart, I have very loose outcomes here, but I'm hoping that by the end of this, all of you will gain some knowledge about something. You'll have some new ideas that you might not have had when you came in, and you might have some possible ways of thinking about doing some of this, or at least perceiving some of this in some way. That's my hope. So I want to talk about the Chemin de Compostelle. And the Chemin de Compostelle in France is the name that we would most likely be more familiar with, the Camino de Santiago de Compostela. And this, along with all of the images that I'll show tonight, I took during this week's trip. And I I can't tell you how even in pulling these together brought me back to these places, these experiences. And that's part of the magic of pilgrimage, and it's part of the magic of the Camino. Now, the Camino started a long time ago, well over 1,000 years ago, as a primarily Christian, because at that point in much of that part of Europe, Christianity was the dominant religion. Many different forms, Christianity was the dominant religion. You go on pilgrimage, usually because you need to celebrate something or because you were told to go for some sort of penance. But you go on this pilgrimage, this long distance. And here it is 1,000 years later, well over 1,000 years later, the people are still walking the Camino. Interestingly enough, the population is actually increasing, not decreasing. It is increasing. So we have the decrease of many organized religions, but the increase in spiritual but not religious. And the Camino is basically bursting at its seams, which I find fascinating on many, many levels, especially as being a researcher. So just a little bit about me. I'm an educational consultant and a transformational strategist. I work a lot with nonprofits and higher education institutions. I am a professor of research methodology. I supervise master's thesis. I get down in the dirt with research, which I just absolutely love. I just absolutely love. I work in higher education accreditation as well. I am a chaplain, which at New York University is called a spiritual life advisor. So I'm the first pagan / eco-spiritual spiritual life advisor that they've had there. I'm a board member of Cherry Hill Seminary. I practice as a spiritual director as well, having completed my 2-year certificate on spiritual direction. I do a lot of editing of Wikipedia. And in the same process, I also volunteer a lot with the global Wikimedia movement. And I do a lot of that, and I really like that globalization. And I'm a Druid. And somehow all of these different pieces here fit together really nicely for me. So how could you not love nature when you're on the Camino? Right? Okay, so that's one of the things about being a Druid. Being a Druid, a neo-Druid, modern Druid, contemporary Druid, of all different forms that are out there. But basically, they really dig nature and they see something maybe borderline more than spiritual related to nature. Right? So it's a nature religious path in many ways. And this is one of the reasons why it brought me to wanting to do this trek last year, because I really needed to get connected to the land of the ancient Gaulish people, which is really where the shaman takes its kind of wanders its way through. And once again, I need to unpack all of that a little bit. So if you will, join me along this trip and I'll explain some things about it. And I'll invite you along the trip that perhaps something sacred or something spiritual might awaken within you in some way that you might not be expecting, and hopefully a positive way. I was blown away by these breathtaking scenes. I was just day after day. It's like just when I thought that I couldn't see something that was more beautiful, I saw it. And with that, I need to back up a little further to give you the context. This really started in 2019 when I did walk the Camino de Santiago. 2019, some of you may remember, that was kind of like when we started hearing about that strange disease, COVID. So in 2019, I walked the Camino across the north of Spain. I did it for 10 days. Some people do it for 5 weeks. I did it for 10 days, which is far more than what is required to get the credential when you walk into this cathedral. Really, it's just down the street from this cathedral in Santiago. Now, this way of St. James, which is what Camino de Santiago is an ancient pilgrim path. Well, really, it's many pilgrim paths. It's not a single one. There are many ways to get here. The traditional one, or what many people today consider the traditional one, goes right across the northern part of Spain. And you get to that part from the northern part of Spain from 4 different routes that go through France. That's generally what people perceive of this. And often when people talk about walking the Camino, they're talking about walking it from the French border to Santiago. I don't have 5 weeks to do the walk because that's pretty much the minimum of what it takes. So I didn't do that much of that walk. But that's what people will still do. And that is the population that's increasing. When I got to Santiago, I had a unusual experience. And by the way, I did take this photo last summer. This was one of the photos outside of one of the little villages that was barely a spot on the map. And I just thought it was great. I just thought it was great because they were specifically talking to pilgrims and hikers here. Okay. Now, why am I sharing this right after the picture of this magnificent cathedral here in Santiago? Because when I got here, I had a strange sense of emptiness. I went through 10 days of walking. The trip itself was a year and a half in planning. So I started planning this trip in 2019. In 2017, there was so much planning that was involved, even though it was with an organized group, but still there was an enormous amount of planning. And I got there and I just felt nothing. I besides sore feet. And that really puzzled me, that troubled me, because before I became a Druid many years ago, I was Catholic, like really Catholic, like really conservative Catholic, really conservative Catholic. And the Camino was always out there as this just amazing experience. I'd always been fascinated with the Camino and I always wanted to walk it. My reasons for wanting to walk it shifted over the years, but then I finally did and I just didn't feel it. I just didn't feel anything. And the only thing that was still left to me is I still feel something was not done. I feel that there's still something else along that path that I need to do. I don't know what it is, but no sooner did I finish, but I started planning the next one, which is a common experience that people who go on the Camino have, except I didn't want to redo what already I did that didn't work. Right? Why do something that doesn't work? Let me try something else that integrates that in. So I looked upstream. And by upstream, I mean, let me look in France. Now, I find myself really connected to France. I love France. Go to France regularly, love France, connect to the spirit in France. I connect to the physical land. And I started poking around to understand a little bit more about what happens in those four paths before they get into Spain and then goes the traditional route to Santiago. And in doing some work, it really all starts in the small village of Le Puy-en-Velay. And in this village, in 951, sorry about that, in this village in 951, the bishop and his retinue decided to walk to Santiago, 951, okay? Now, this is before the first book that was written on the pilgrimage, the Codex Calixtus, came out. So in 951, this bishop and his retinue walked over the Pyrenees. He decided to stop at a monastery, someplace in the north of Spain, commissioned a manuscript to be written on something, and said, oh, by the way, I'm going to pick it up on my way back. Went to Santiago months later, came back, monks, finished doing this manuscript, took it, thank you very much, gave them their offering, walked back to Le Puy-en-Velay. Really significant piece. He's actually the first named person we know of, Godesalk. He's the first named person we know of walking over the Pyrenees on pilgrimage. So his name is in the book that he had done in the monastery, still exists in the archives in Paris at this point. But it's really important because historically, this gives a certain historicity. People knew that people did the Camino for many years, but it wasn't written down. As a researcher, you need things to be written down by an objective source. This was written down by the monks who wrote about some of this in this book, which they wrote for the bishop and they gave him on his way. And I really like that history. I really like the history. So I decided that not only do I still need to walk, but I'm going to walk in France. And I want to start in front of this cathedral here in Le Puy-en-Velay, which is what I did last year in 2022 in June. So I started the walk there. And this is about 4 weeks northeast, give or take, of the French-Spanish border. Once again, I don't have 4 weeks I could take as a walking tour, right? Or a walking hike. I just couldn't do it. So I did a week. And in the process of the planning, I found, you know what, that's pretty common in France. People will do a week at a time because that becomes part of vacation. And they gradually, year after year, see some of their progression. And by the way, the bishop there ended up laying the cornerstone of this church on this volcanic kind of like, it's right behind the cathedral. It's an amazing place that's actually quite a lot higher. So I walked up into it the day before I started. Actually, quite a lot higher than I realized when I went there. Now, I took 1,490 pictures along this trip, which was 7 days. I walked for 7 days. Now, it was 8 days because we actually started walking the prior day of that. So during this period, every picture you see, with the exception of the picture of Santiago, which I shot a couple of years before that, before COVID, I took. So from Lepuy and Valais, these are the small villages which we walked through. And I walked with a colleague of mine. I live in New York, and a colleague of mine lives in Seattle. I was already over in France. He flew over, and we took 3 trains. It took us a full day to get to Lepuy for us to start this. And we started from Lepuy and Valais. We then took a van, if you will, a Camino van that literally shepherds pilgrims along the way in their luggage. We took that to Saint-Alban-sur-le-Mignon. That's where we started. And then these are the villages that we hit. We stayed in Aumont-Aubrac, Montgros, Saint-Chély, Espalion-Estang, Golignac, and Conques. So the trip was from Lepuy to Conques. Conques was a spectacular village. These are very small villages in the French countryside. It would surprise me if any of you had ever even heard of them. They're very small. But it was an unbelievably spectacular place. And since I knew that I could walk for about 7 days, let me find a 7-day path that is somewhat connected to trains so I can get back to Paris, but also gives me a sense of I'm starting and I'm finishing. That's really what pilgrimage is. You start and then you go through the journey and then you finish someplace. So while the numerous paths are often considered literally spiritually, they are more complex. The experience of the people who go on the Camino shift. And the reasons that people go are numerous. As a trained qualitative researcher, I'm thinking about this from an autoethnographic inquiry. And I thought about it as a methodology to problematize aspects of the experience. Remember, this started out as a Catholic pilgrimage. Okay, I haven't been Catholic for 30 years. So what I found is most people walking it also weren't explicitly religious, but the amount of spirituality was breathtaking and quite honestly awe-inspiring for the people that I met. Now, it was along this 1,000-year-old Catholic, as I mentioned, but rather than getting to the end to honor the saint, I wanted to honor the spirits of the land along the route. I wanted to honor the ancient gods that had been prayed there before Christianity, before the Romans got there. That's the population, which we know very, very little about, but I somehow felt called to this. I don't know how else to say it. I somehow felt that this is what I need to do. And in doing, I ended up feeling some of that emptiness that I had when I did this across the northern route of Spain in 2019. And the only thing that I could think about in this process is I need to be closer to nature. Now, along the path, along the north of Spain, spectacular, beautiful, beautiful. If any of you have ever seen it or seen pictures, it's beautiful. One of the first things that you would notice compared to the pictures that I'll be showing you, most of my pictures don't have people in them because the path in France is a lot less traveled. Most of the pilgrims who go across the northern Spain are, let's say, there are a lot of people. And by the way, just so you know, let me just back up a little bit more. In 2019, was the highest number of pilgrims ever recorded walking into Santiago in Spain, 350,000. COVID shut down everything. Last year, kind of post-COVID, I still wear a mask in public, but kind of post-COVID, last year, 430,000 people, the largest number on record, made it to Santiago. And not just walked the last couple of miles, they had to walk the last 100 kilometers, 80 miles, give or take, in order to get the credential. That is the number that was the 430,000. The number of people who have a spiritual connection to pilgrimage in these ancient, now new hiking paths is increasing. And of course, in the process, we need signs. So throughout, in France, you follow the signs on what's called the Grande Randonnée, the great paths, the great hiking paths. And they all have this one, which was actually the GR65, also called the Camino, or the Chemin, that had the white with the red. So anytime you saw that, and you saw that everywhere, it was on trees, it was on literally things by fields, it was on posts, it was all over the place. Every time we saw that, you know that that's the way to go. Now, sometimes you'll see regular signs, of course, and you're keeping in mind, we always know the direction we're walking. And if you go too far and don't see one of the red and white signs, that means you made a mistake. So you'd backtrack a little bit until you get back on that. And the 65, the Chemin de Saint-Jacques de Compostelle in French, with that ubiquitous sign of the shell, this was really throughout, and it seems to be increasing with the formalized signs. You'll notice on the lower left of the sign, there we have the white and the red. So you have that, which is the official colors of this hiking path, the GR65. But the GR65 hiking and the spiritual ancient path have really merged in this new configuration that really is wonderful because it meets many, many different needs. So as we were walking along, once again, you see this all over the place, especially when the paths will go here. Should I go here? Or should I go left? Should I go right? And by the way, on the upper right, you'll see my hiking partner there, my walking partner who came with me. And you see this, and then sometimes you see the arrows. And by the way, I love on that bale of hay, somebody drew that kind of like picture with a magic marker. And what it looks like if you stand back a little bit, you see some other things, which I just thought were really kind of cute. Because while I was there as a spiritual hiker, as a pilgrim, I'm walking through lands where people actually live and where people actually work and they go about their lives, knowing that there's a steady stream of people who are here for whether it's physical, whether it's spiritual, whether it's emotional, whatever it is, they're walking through this way. And it took us through a number of this path last summer, took us through 3 of these Les Plus Beaux Villages, which that's an actual title that's awarded to small villages of a small population that still have an ancient or medieval type feel. In other words, they haven't been built over. And we passed 3 of them along this way. And otherwise, there are also signs, such as signs about some of the ancient Romans and the Roman roads. But then you'll find many of what we would consider more of the Christian or the Catholic perspectives. This walking through France, which was a traditionally Catholic nation, we'll find these kinds of roadside shrines, roadside reminders carved all over the place, And of course, some of these signs are really helpful for people who either don't speak French or don't speak French terribly well. In other words, don't drink water when it's like this. I was also humbled by the amount of these that I saw. I stop, by the way, when I am on pilgrimage, I stop by in every church. If it's a church and I can get in, I go in. I love going to churches, and every church we entered had this, which was the memory of those who died, usually just during the First World War. Some of them also included the Second World War. Notice the dates. What happens is the further southwest that we went, the further we would only see the First World War. And I think, once again, with signs, it's humbling when you look at these names, how many of the names are the same? Some of these 3, 4, 5 people in the same family who died in war, the least I could do is honor their memories as I'm honoring and working through my own in the process. So all of this is kind of bubbling up as I'm walking along the Camino, including when you see some pictures like this, or some signs like this about taking care of certain animals. Please don't feed this one. This is the name, they have allergies and things like this. Because we're walking on trails that literally go through fields or go along fields, cow paths, those sorts of things. So you'll find very often these sorts of things, and then you'll find people kind of like doing little graffiti on them and things, as you'd expect in many places. But these are the signs, once again, ubiquitous, white and red, were everywhere. And that always told us that we're going in the right direction. Because while I certainly had my phone with me, so I have GPS, I can find maps if I need to, the GPS maps usually don't show hiking trails. So this was really important. And it was hard to imagine that little sign of some of the for winter, giving a sense on what this is like during the winter. The last day that we walked last summer, it was 95 degrees. So walking 80 miles in the 90s was brutal. And it's hard to imagine that there would ever be that kind of snow that you could do that. There's my little picture again. So while these signs point the way, we also just follow the path. And it's path sometimes paved, sometimes it was a path which we would get out of the way because a group of sheep were coming or a tractor was coming, but it was ever onward, ever onward. Sometimes the paths were rather narrow like this. There was really every kind of path that you would imagine. And these are the ones that just really struck me. I just felt my soul being filled with this. And I didn't touch up the sky. It was that blue. It was, I didn't touch up any of these pictures. It was really that I found astoundingly beautiful. After each bend, there was just more. It was just more. Some places we couldn't even see where it was going, but you didn't need to know, because pilgrimage isn't necessarily about going, it's following the path and seeing what magic happens along that path, which is how I started this when we started at the beginning with this very image. It was amazing, the presence of nature, the presence of the trees, the presence of these stones. Notice the lichen on the stones, the moss that were on these stones. These stones have been there likely for hundreds of years, pulled out to have the barriers between the fields long before this paved road was put there. Kind of back in the days when these were the roads. So onward we went. Some forests, some fields, some things that were in between. Some things that felt in some ways so private and so personal. Once again, I didn't take a lot of photos with a lot of people. There really weren't a lot of people. Most of the time I was walking privately. My walking companion was taller than me, therefore longer strides. Therefore, suddenly it's like, oh, where'd he go? Okay, well, I know I'll see him in another hour or two. And I got to walk in silence. But it really wasn't silent. Because if you've been in nature, you know when nature's not silent. You hear birds, you hear the ruffle of trees, you hear the sound of water, you hear the sound of cows, you hear just the breeze. There's a sense of presence that's there that I just imbibed, that I just kind of breathed in. And by the way, this image of this bridge, this is a bridge that it was actually listed by the United Nations when they made the route of the chemin de Saint-Jacques-de-Compostelle in France part of a World Heritage Site. And if you go to the Wikipedia article on this village, which is Saint Shelley d'Aubrac, you'll see this picture because I uploaded it there because it was missing. This is an ancient bridge. This bridge goes back to the 1400s or so. And this is one of those things, as an American, I really liked. I really liked some of this ancient feel, this ancient ways of doing something, this ancient path that goes up the right, which is actually where the path went, compared to the road here on the left. Now notice, even though it's an ancient path, they actually did do some things. You'll notice on the path to the right, they actually did put concrete there because it's an ancient path, but it does get washed away with lots of feet over it. So there were those kinds of protections that were out there because we're walking, but people were going about their lives. People were going to the churches. People were stopping in the villages. This was just a beautiful village. Nasbanal was called. People were about their lives doing stuff. This was in front of the church at Nasbanal. I needed to stop in Nasbanal because I needed to get some more medication because I wasn't feeling terribly well. Shortly into that, I'll come back to that a little bit later. And once again, I take pictures everywhere. I love going to churches. St. Joan of Arc, everywhere. Proper Catholic church in France isn't Catholic unless it has Joan of Arc. And really everywhere in this part of the country, you're going to find St. Roche. It was just that these are the ones that were everywhere. Besides, of course, St. James, so St. Jacques. And St. Jacques was also on all of these because people walking on the Giro 65, many of them are pilgrims anyway. So these paths, this really contemporary sculpture, which I just thought was profound. In silence and solitude, we hear only the essential. That's basically the translation. And it gave me time to pause. And if you notice what the surrounding is, you can't help but wanting to do that. At least my hunch is none of you here could help wanting to do that. That's why you're here, wanting to listen to me talk about some of this. Whether some of the buildings in the life were no longer inhabited, and we found lots of those. We also found all sorts of creative things, or creative arts. There were there was an artist who did all kinds of creative things. I would have loved to have gotten some of his work. Of course, carrying a backpack, because I did carry my backpack the whole trip for the 8 days. I obviously couldn't put more weight in that. I weighed enough even without my backpack. But just these beautiful old villages that we went through, they were just spectacular. It's what I always wanted to do. When you go through the books, it's like, wow, this is beautiful. Wonder what it's like. It's a lot more interesting than when you're not driving through them. So walking through that, you start to notice this. I'd never seen one of these kinds of actual poles, right? If you think maypole, some of these actually exist in real life. This was actually there, which I just thought was wonderful, just wonderful. And we were never far from images of the shells, never far from that, reminding us of where we were, even though the farmers were going about their business and they're going and doing the thing that people have been doing, maybe using different machinery. They've been doing the same thing in these same areas for 1,000 years, 2,000 years. Of course, the cattle. I'm a vegetarian. So when I see cattle, I think, ooh, cheese. Because, right? But that's not necessarily the case with these cows here. But the cows were all over the place. And these spotted horses were also a little bit less common, but they were present. So we saw the animals around while we're doing the constant walking, trying to make sense of all of this, because once again, in great silence, in great solitude. And I love it. This was one of those places where I had to pause because I didn't know the direction. And short of there on the tree, almost buried within the tree, is the sign, the white and the red, which tells me that the path should be going that direction and not to the left. If I did go to the left, I would have gone around 20 feet, and you would see instead a white and red little X someplace, which would have said you're going the wrong way. But if you're not paying attention, you will go the wrong way and you'll miss it. And isn't that wonderful to foster presence and not multitasking, which is what often we have to deal with quite often throughout our regular lives. I got out of the way of these two fellows who were going with these kind of like off-road mountain bike type things. They were actually pedaling. These are not electric bikes. And I heard them coming. And when I got out of the way, I was shocked to find that they were not quite twice my age, but they were easily 20 or 30 years older than I am, in far better shape. And once again, I was a little jealous. And if they could do it, I could do it. So onward we went. And then the nature, which is really what I wanted to see that was there, was just in bloom all over the place. This was mid-June. So we see flowers, there are trees, there is the heat that was there. Thankfully, we avoided the large forest fires that went across much of France last summer. Those things really started to touch on the borderline of these areas very close to after we finished. Some of these ancient rocks, people used to go to this. This had only been closed off. I couldn't even get up to it. These had only been closed off really in the prior year or two. People used to go there and they talked about some wonderful patterns of meditation between some of these rocks right behind them. The lizards I saw along the way, and constantly, isn't this a metaphor for life? Which path do you want? Remember that poem from Robert Frost, right? Two roads diverge in the yellow wood, right? In the road less traveled. And here it's ironic because I'm the one choosing which path to take. And I'm the one choosing to take the path that will lead me ever onward, step after step along the pilgrimage. And if I do that and keep away from my devices for this short period of time, I get to be astounded by the colors. I get to be astounded by the wonders of nature that I otherwise just would have missed zooming along in my life. And this is why I wanted to walk the Camino again, specifically this time in France, where I felt a little bit more comfortable. My French is a little bit better. But I did have a strange draw to the land that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And yes, that is a bee in the center. I don't know if you're able to see it. So, it was this of why I felt that I needed to come. And I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know what the experience was going to be like. I didn't know I was going to see flowers along the way. But I felt that I needed to go this way. And I was rewarded, and here it is a year later. And I'm still processing the experience. And if any of you have ever talked to anybody who's gone on a pilgrimage, you will probably hear them saying something similar. I thought I understood it at the time. X amount of time has passed, and I'm now thinking about it differently. There's another B there. I'm now understanding something new. Some new experience has been opened, like the very flowers themselves, that gives me opportunity to pause and reflect more deeply, to see something I might not have seen at first, perhaps about the world around me, or perhaps about just me. Even the beauty of this little flower on the side of this little road, which would otherwise be considered a weed, but it stopped me. It stopped me. Now, I'm doing this as a pilgrim, so I do have prayers. I am doing rituals along the way. I'm not quite doing this kind of ritual, right? That wasn't quite me, but I did stop at every church. There's something mystically amazing about these tiny country churches out in the middle of virtually nowhere. And I stopped at these, and one was more beautiful than the next. And of course, the most spectacular of them was right at the end in Conques, with this ancient village and this basilica in honor of Saint Foy. Just a wonderful story. And it was just the inside of the church itself was just as spectacular as this was. But I really came for simpler things. And I love how along the Camino, and people do this in Spain as well, they leave little stones, whether those are stones that they pick up along the way and they drop off, or they're stones they take with them from where they start and leave it as an offering to unload ourselves from the weight that we carry around us, which is really at the heart of how pilgrimage started. We carry weight. And we all have our own personal weight. Now, of course, I do this because of my connection with nature. And I had never seen a Christmas cactus like this. This is a Christmas cactus in one of the churches that I took a photo of. The center of it was not only bark, but it was probably bark so thick that if I tried to break it, which I wouldn't, but I wouldn't be able to because it was really that solid. It was that old. And I was really impressed. Not only was the village old, but even the living plants inside the church was old. This was actually in the church in Estang. Once again, pilgrims would leave stones, and I often found myself stopping and wondering what was the meaning behind the people who left those stones here, and what did I have in common with them, and did I have that was a little different from them. One of the things that I did, as Druids tend to do, is I do ritual along the way. And I planned on at some point doing a ritual along the way. Just me, 5 minutes, call out to the gods, that's it. But I wanted to find the best place for it. So I bought this bottle. I mean, the bottle was actually full of alcohol. I bought the bottle. That's what I let out in the ritual when I came to the stone that looked strangely like a natural altar in the middle of this forest along the way. I had a 5-minute ritual. I said some prayers, perfectly silent outside of just the sounds of nature. There weren't anybody who came by until literally I was packing things back up. Because, of course, I wasn't going to leave an empty bottle in the woods. I was going to take that back with me and then dispose of that for recycling. So those rituals and those prayers came in all sorts of different forms. How we have the water and we stop for the water. How we have the mists and what is hidden in there. What is hidden in our lives? What meaning is someplace in between that is still hidden to us at this moment? Constantly surrounded us. This was really right at the end. This was the final morning of the trip when I took the prayers that I carried with me, and I'll share a link with all of you here when I do this again in about another month and a half. I asked people, I'm going on this pilgrimage. I will take intentions, whatever intention you want. I won't read it, but I will print it. I will carry it with me each day. And at the end, I will burn it because somehow in praying for these different people's intentions, many people I didn't even know, just tell me what it was. I created a little online form. I exported it as a spreadsheet. That's what got folded and stuck in my pocket. And I carried it with me. And I often took it out, not to read, but I took it out while I was saying prayers because these are prayers of people who couldn't do, for whatever reason, what I was able to do last year. And I felt kind of a responsibility, but I also found, isn't this the wonderful way to share? I was able to share with all of these people some special intention that they had in a way that otherwise it may have just remained internally to them. And then I burnt it. And amazingly enough, on that final day, there was the paper on the left. There was me burning it with a couple of matches. That what was left at the end. There was not an ash left. I was just amazed by that. Just amazed by that. So I prayed actively, and then I enjoyed the silence. So as I was walking, I was saying prayers to the sacred beings. And I wasn't listening for an answer, but I was just listening for whatever came up. And that silence was profound. I was able to see things I might not have noticed otherwise. I was able to think about paths that stretched on to infinity. And I'm walking on them. And as this was concluding, as I was going down these final paths through different kinds of biomes, different geographical regions, different kinds of ways of looking, on and on and on, this ever onward. That's what pilgrims really like. Right? The feet start to hurt, but I'm still going to go ever onward. Whatever I saw along the way, whatever there's one more hill that's climbing up, which is tiring, and climbing down is tiring. And each time we do that, each time we glimpse at something that's old but is really new again, it gives us an opportunity to think about life. It gives me an opportunity to think about life, my life, where I'm going, where I want to go. And thanks to some people who actually offered drinkable water, eau potable, and somebody who wrote merci. In other words, thank you for doing that. So as we saw that, ever onward, all I kept on thinking here was bread. I can't wait to the next meal. I get to have more bread. That's part of what we do in France, isn't it? And in that process, through these trees, through thinking about this, the unexpected happens. So these couple unexpected things I just want to share, and then I will bring all of this to a closure with what I learned along the process and what happens next. One section, beautiful sign, lots of great pictures. I took several photos, several different things. I read some of it, looked really interesting. I would read it later. Mistake. Because when I got to this section, and yes, you'll notice that the bowl there and the cows, are in the field, and there's no fence between me and that field. Because you walk through, in this section, you walk through fields of cattle. And that bull there was making really scary sounds. And he was walking up toward the gate with the big arrow that I was supposed to go out. And behind him was this other cow, and behind that was the herd of cows. And he was making very unpleasant sounds. And he was bigger than I was, faster than I was, and he had horns. And it's his field. I was terrified. I was terrified. So you might find this interesting, but it was at that moment, for the first time in 30 years, that I called out to St. Francis. And to this day, I still call out to St. Francis. So this was one of the unexpected things. I needed to go way up in the field and go underneath barbed wire on my back to try to get out of this field, because I couldn't, because even if I got past this bull, there's a bull right on the other side with his herd. So that's kind of where I went, up by this little abandoned thing, and I kind of went underneath the barbed wire. Another thing that started to happen is in the one town that was actually kind of built up that we ended up staying in, which was great. But outside of that, the next morning, we met this little lady who made the food that she has up there. And she was, basically this is part of her livelihood. She would sell little pieces of food and to pilgrims, and I'm not one to say no to a kindly old lady who's making food for us. So at that point, I'd already had a big breakfast. I couldn't bear to have another food. So I just wanted to give her, a couple of euros to, but that doesn't work in the south of France. You just don't give money. You give money, that means she gave me a bigger piece of the cake, which I did not want, but I couldn't say no. So I'm walking along, eating a piece of this cake. And the fellow who you see here was a retired firefighter. We ended up meeting him and his colleagues here. They were 4 firefighters who were walking the Chemin from Le Puy all the way to the border. They were doing that because 2 of them were retiring. This was their retirement party. And the other 2 came along as kind of like moral support. They were firefighters in Lyon, which I thought was really, really interesting. And who would have known that, and who would have even expected that? Because I spent so much of my time in silence, but there's a whole world of different people doing different things along the Chemin, that if I am now comfortable enough in my silence, I can now be open to hearing some of the stories of others. And in this beautiful tower that we stayed in, it's an ancient tower, it's mostly haunted. I heard about that. It had just an enormous room with this ancient stairway that went up. These were chaplains were here back in the 1500s. That was my room. There's another bed I have on the other side of that, and then it was just an enormous room just for myself. Anyway, I heard the story about it being haunted over dinner that night, which of course meant that I stayed up half the night thinking about it. And on top of that, I got sick. I got really sick. I came down with really, really bad bronchitis. I was awake I slept maybe an hour that night because I couldn't breathe, because I kept on choking, because I was so sick. And it was only because I ended up carrying some emergency medication with me, calling my doctor in the middle of the night, back to New York, that I was able to literally finish, because it was in this location, which actually, this is outside my window. This is what the church that I looked out on. It was in this location that I was afraid that I wasn't going to be able to finish. I was midway through, and I thought I would need to stop my pilgrimage cycle there. And thankfully I wasn't. Between the medications and just the beauty around me and the powers of the sacred around, I was able to continue. But I was really sick in this picture. I was really sick in this picture. And then finally, the last thing that was unexpected, leaving this cute little village of Golignac, where we stayed in a nice place, great food, really, really personable folks. Leaving that, we finally had the first rain of the entire trip. And boy, did it come down. It was lightning all over the place. It was really quite scary. Scary to the point where I'm not sure we should really be walking this scary. But if we don't walk, we're not going to get to where we need to go tonight. Like that kind of bit. So, of course, we go, you go out of the rain, which is, under trees, which is not exactly where you want to go in a lightning storm, but it was okay. It worked out. It was either that or stand out in the field, which also wasn't quite a good idea. But I did get to try out the full outfit that I had that went over me and my backpack. So nice, suffice it to say, at least we did not get wet, meaning my backpack and I, because I did carry my backpack along the whole trip. Now, the dissonance between intentions, assumptions, and meaning making is shared by many people who walk the Camino. And that is really at the crux of what did I learn along the way. I learned that pilgrimage is really walking with spiritual intention. Pilgrimage is not so much any longer about getting to the end. Like you don't just walk around aimlessly. You walk towards something. But pilgrimage is really what happens along the way. It's not what happens when you get to the destination. And in that, the learning occurs while on the journey along the path. The learning doesn't happen at the end. Oh, great, here's the book. Now go learn it. The learning happens in the dailiness along the path because the journey is the destination. That, for me, is key to pilgrimage. The journey is the destination. Likewise, meaning making comes in time. I did this last June in 2022. A day does not go by where I do not, in some way, reflect on my experience. I kid you not. A day does not go by where something doesn't either remind me of my time along the Shema, or I actually don't think fondly about it. In some way, that meaning making unfurls, deepens in the process, because only through connecting with nature can we be silent. That's what I found for me. It was that silence that I needed that I didn't have along the first one in 2019, because quite honestly, there's just too many people with too much talking. I do that all day long. I'm a consultant. That's what I do, is I talk a lot. I listen to people. I'm in meetings all the time. And that's wonderful. I love that kind of work. But I needed a retreat. And yes, retreats can be pilgrimages, because solvitur ambulando, it is solved by walking. Whatever it is, it can be solved by walking. So what comes next? What am I doing next? Well, this is what I'm doing next. I'm walking from Figeac to Cahors. I'm walking this starting it's going to be the first week of June. So here it is. That wasn't enough, so I needed more. So what I'm doing is I'm starting about 3 days from where I left last time. I'm starting that because 3 days where I left last time is a lot more difficult to get to. Once again, 3 trains plus a taxi from Paris. This one, Figeac, is actually going to be just 3 trains from Paris, a full day of trips. But I don't need to take a 45-minute taxi ride, which I did in the last one where I ended. And I'll be walking from Figeac to Cahors, taking the train from Figeac, taking the train back from Cahors. First week, this one is going to be only 6 days. These 6 days, it's going to be 68 miles. Don't let the 53.7 miles fool you. Google Maps doesn't track hiking trails. It tracks roads. So this one's going to be 68 miles, which is 20 miles less than last year. I'll be walking it with my husband's nephew. So because even though I feel completely confident and completely happy walking along, it's better to not walk completely alone. If somebody fell along the way, they would be alone for a little while, probably about 10 minutes, until the next hiker/pilgrim came by. So it would be too much, right? It would be too much. But this is pretty rural, as you saw with these pictures. These were not cherry-picked pictures. This was really what much of it looked like. So I offer to all of you, what can you do? What can you do with this? Well, if you think about pilgrimage as walking with spiritual intention, right, what might that look like? So I invite you to think, have you ever considered a pilgrimage? Here, any of you who are listening to this and watching this, have you ever considered a pilgrimage? Not maybe necessarily one that stretches on for a week or a month, but how about a day? How about 2 days? How about something Not even that you need to fly halfway around the world and spend an entire day of 7 hours to get to. It doesn't need to be that complicated. And if you have considered pilgrimage, how do you explain it to others? Or better yet, how do you explain it to yourself? Because when I went, the first time I went, I could not explain why I wanted to go outside of, I need to do this. The second time, which is the time that I shared all of these images here with you, the only thing I could share is I need to be in silence. I need to experience nature in silence. I don't know why. I don't know what's going to come up, but I just feel that I need that. So in your lives, I invite you to consider how pilgrimage can involve any travel to any spiritual site, hiking a local or national park, walking a labyrinth, or just daily walking around your block. If you believe that pilgrimage is walking with spiritual intention, we walk, and we walk ever onward. So thank you so much. It was nice for hearing all of you, seeing all of you here, and I look forward to whatever kind of questions or thoughts you might want to share. So, but I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Jeffrey, do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Certainly.
Not that I want to stop looking at that. Thank you so much. I think we're all applauding loudly in our hearts. It was wonderful.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
It's especially meaningful for me. I feel like I just got home yesterday, and everybody here has been good to listen to me blather on already a fair amount. Does anybody have a reaction to this? How did it make you feel?
I thought it was wonderful. The pictures were very stirring, and the message that Jeffrey gave us as he showed us the pictures was very, very interesting. It made me wonder how widespread Druids are in the world. Are they found in other countries?
Yes, there are Druids of various groups throughout North America, certainly throughout Europe, especially focused around England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, that part of the world. But in my last trip to France, I was in France over the holidays this past year. I took a 3.5-hour train to Brittany, where I met with a Druid friend and colleague of mine who I knew for years, but I never met in person. And we drove around that part of very, very remote Western France. And he was pointing to all of these ancient sites that really harken to some of that Celtic-ness of Druidry that we would actually find in parts of Spain, because there's a strong Celtic influence in the north. On the northwestern part of Spain, literally the Camino will walk through that. So in this way, Druidry, which I think could be loosely understood by many people in many different ways, involves generally just connecting to the natural world on some spiritual and or religious level. And by the way, I know lots of Christian Druids too.
Yeah.
The thing that prompted the question is that a few weeks ago, I was with a group that traveled in Israel. And we stopped one day for lunch at a restaurant that it was on Mount Carmel. And the people at the restaurant, waiters, cooks, etc., were Druids. And I was very surprised, but they were very hospitable. And the food was excellent. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. That's wonderful. Right? Small world, you never know what you're going to expect to find surprises.
Yeah.
Well, y'all know that my big pilgrimage was to Egypt. And this isn't a question, Jeffrey, but I found myself remembering a few years ago when Cherry Hill had a student intensive in Missouri on the border of Kansas. And Clyde and I decided to drive there because it was still another almost 2 hours south of the nearest airport. And we were just tired of dealing with airports. So we made it a road trip, and it was just gorgeous, driving all across northern Alabama, Mississippi, up through the Ozarks. And we found ourselves coming up to Jonesboro, Arkansas, where I had been a consultant for, I don't know, maybe 8 months doing a capital campaign with the little Episcopal church there back in the 90s. And just maybe 4 months after I left was the shooting that happened there, which was one of the first big school shootings. And the church was next door to that school. And at the time, there was a preschool at the church. And I know that the woods where those young boys went out of the school, the middle school in Jonesboro, and they went up to the woods and just picked off children as they came out of the grade school. And those woods were beside that church. And I just kind of had been haunted by all of that. And a lot had changed in my life. And I felt compelled to go find that church. And Jonesboro's like tripled in size and population since then. It wasn't the little tiny place I was in. And I went to the church and walked around. And there was I had some need that I still can't quite explain. But I needed to ground myself, and I found myself hearing you talking sort of that way too. Jeffrey was the last person in America I heard from before I flew off, and had virtually no contact. Actually, I did. You're the only person I called. That's right.
Really?
I did call from the boat. Yeah. But you texted me as we were leaving New York when we were at JFK, and you said, remember to bring your gods back with you so they become the gods of this place too. And I'm sharing that primarily for Mella's benefit, and I don't know, maybe you too, Carl, with perhaps an intellectual curiosity, but modern contemporary pagans are much exercised these days about figuring out what's cultural appropriation and what's what's going native and what's genuine and all of, and you can imagine that for somebody like me, and I'd never even been to Egypt, and I could not tell you, all I knew was I had this connection, and I'd had these personal experiences I've shared with some of you. And so it was not cultural appropriation for me, but there's also not a current ancient Egyptian presence to be stealing from like our Native Americans. But that meant a lot to me that you reminded me to invite my gods to be the gods of this place when I came back, so that they were no longer something remote, even though they were in my heart and they were very powerful personal presence. Yeah, I've married them to this little piece of land here. But thank you for that. But I kept telling, I might have heard your talk before then, but I mean, I knew, it was hard. I've told all of y'all, I've whined and played my violin. I'm sitting here, with neuropathy in my feet that it will take it. The doc says a year to heal. I mean, it was a hard trip. But I knew that was just part of the journey. And that there would be things that would come to me out of that too. It was not a vacation. I wasn't there to sit by the pool. I appreciated how you are, Jeffrey, able to reflect, kind of seamlessly between your Catholic upbringing and background and your current spirituality. Because I find that all of those things, all of my past is still part of me.
Took a long time to get there. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, my traveling companion knew that after about the first or second day, it's like, oh, there's a church. Okay, that's where Jeffrey will be. because I went into every one I could see, because they were just so incredibly different. And many of these churches, and people have used them for hundreds of years. I mean, it's nothing like the U.S. where, oh my gosh, if it's 50 years old, tear it down and build a new. You know, maybe a little exaggeration there, but just some of these churches that at this point, given the way the religion is practiced in France, at this point, there are more hikers and pilgrims who go into most of these churches than anybody else. But that's okay, because that's part of the experience. 1,000 years ago, when Godesal did this, he would have stopped at every church too. And while most of these, I don't think we went into any that were that old, but some of them actually had foundations that dated to that time. So for me, it was not so much just walking along this ancient path, but walking along this ancient path that for 1,000 years people have walked on, carrying their needs with them, carrying their whatever it is that they carried with them, whatever that they let go along the way, and whatever they picked up along the way. Those energies were steered into those lands. Similar to if you, as you mentioned, Holly, going to that church, and you just felt that there was just something that you needed to go there for. It doesn't matter if you can't explain it to anybody else. You needed it. And it doesn't matter if you couldn't explain it to yourself. You needed it. There was something about there that you just had to be. And that's what kind of like led me to this part of the shaman itself. I knew that I needed silence. And I'm not really big into silence, but one of the things I surprised myself is that new monasticism has become really, really important in my life. And who would have imagined that there would have been that kind of turn to really embracing silence out there in the natural world? I'm a city boy. I've lived most of my life in big cities, and I kind of go city to city, and that's where my work is. But that's what made this perhaps even more special, because it was that spiritual hike, but it was also a retreat. It was also that introspection time that I don't want to just sit in a chair for a week and reflect, and I'm never one to sit by a pool. So, so how do I kind of work that in? And I couldn't explain it. But I was glad that I had people around me who I didn't need to explain it to, who said, that's just wonderful, just go do it.
Did you feel a closer connection to people from maybe even the Roman occupation that you could assume you were descended from, who had lived on that same land? Because I felt that when I was in Egypt.
Yeah, definitely. And in part because the Romans were so thorough in their conquest of Gaul that it's very difficult even now to kind of like separate. This was the Roman influence, the Gallo-Romans, and this was the Gauls, like literally the pre-Roman Gauls. It's very, very difficult to disentangle those two. There are places where you can still see it in some of the ancient archaeological sites, but from a religious or cultural perspective, they're really just integrated. It's like, can you imagine thinking of Italy without Catholicism? It's like, huh? How could you do that? Doesn't mean everybody's like that, but the history has just been so integrated like that it's hard to see where one comes and one goes.
Sarah, do you know if there was much war activity in the region you walked through?
Well, we saw that with the First World War, with a number of people who went and fought, but that generally wasn't in that part. If anything, that would have been much closer to where France was divided during Vichy France, and literally the Nazi occupation. So that wasn't quite in this area, but it would have been a lot more proximate there. And my Matt, who I traveled with last year, and I had talked about that, and we had wondered if the further that we walked, we saw very, very few World War II memorials, many from the Great War, very, very few from the Second World War. And we were almost wondering, because the history in many parts of France is so troubled, even today, from that, if it was just not marked because it was just a painful time to mark that, because of just what was going on to literally survive. And so that's speculation. I don't know, but it was notable on how much the tiniest village you would not find, even in the tiniest village, not to have a World War I memorial of some sort. Very rare from any of the other wars.
I'm looking at the time and thinking that it's about the witching hour for us. What do you think? Does anybody else have questions or comments? Jeffrey, we thank you so very much. I know how busy you are, and we just really appreciate the gift of your time and this beautiful sharing.
Well, wonderful. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to speak with all of you about this. If anybody has any questions or anything like that, get in touch with Holly. She could certainly get in touch with me. But it was a pleasure, and I'm always game to talk about this, because the more talking I do, the more I continue to process it.
Yeah.
Believe it or not. So,
Yeah.
thank you so much. Bright blessings all.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
Thank
thank you.
Great to be with everybody. All right.
Thank you.
Bless you. See you later.
Yeah.
Thank you.